August 7, 1942. Dawn. Lunga Point, Guadalcanal. The humidity hits first, thick, wet, suffocating. Jungle insects scream as if they already sense what's coming. Offshore, the ocean is crowded with dark silhouettes, steel giants cutting their engines one by one. Then the sky cracks open. Naval guns thunder, shaking the island awake. Palm trees shudder. Birds scatter. And somewhere in the tangled green, Japanese soldiers lift their heads, confused, not yet knowing this island is about to become the center of a new kind of war. The landing ramps drop. U.S. Marines charge into the surf. Rifles held high, packs dragging them down. They push toward a shoreline that looks deceptively peaceful. No beaches of Normandy here, just jungle. Thick, endless jungle. The kind that swallows sound, hides movement, and kills men slowly. Within hours, the Marines push inland and reach their objective, a half-finished Japanese airstrip carved out of the earth like a wound. They call it Henderson Field now. And it's useless. The ground is uneven, muddy, choked with roots and rocks. The runway is barely scratched into existence, surrounded by jungle that presses in from all sides like a living enemy. And overhead, Japanese aircraft still own the sky. This is where most invasions would pause, regroup, dig in, wait. Instead, something unexpected happened. As Marines fan out to secure the perimeter, another group comes ashore. No dramatic charges. No bayonets. Just men in dusty uniforms carrying tools instead of rifles. Bulldozers grind forward, their engines growling like beasts being dragged onto land. Trucks follow. Cranes. Graders. These men are U.S. Navy construction battalions. The Seabees. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Robert R. Plidger, steps onto the island and looks at the chaos, mud, shell holes, half-cleared ground, unexploded bombs. He doesn't see a battlefield. He sees a job site, and the clock is already ticking. Because every Japanese officer on Guadalcanal knows one thing. If the Americans get that airfield operational, the island is lost. Air power will choke off reinforcements. Bombers will dominate the sea lanes. The jungle will no longer protect them. So the Japanese prepare to destroy the runway before that can happen. The Seabees don't wait. Bulldozers roll forward as rifle fire cracks from the treeline. Engineers jump down and start clearing debris while artillery shells burst close enough to shower them with dirt. There are no rear lines here. No safe zone. Every man understands it. If the runway isn't finished fast, none of them are leaving this island. They work anyway. You can almost feel the heat, sun beating down, sweat pouring into eyes, mud sucking at boots. Hands blister. Engines overheat. Equipment breaks. And still they push on, repairing, leveling, compacting. Every minute counts. Japanese artillery begins walking shells across the airfield. One explosion flips a bulldozer onto its side like a toy. The operator crawls out, bleeding, and another man climbs in. The engine roars back to life. By nightfall, Henderson Field looks barely improved. To an outside observer, it's still a mess. But the Seabees know better. They've done just enough. On August 12, 5 days after the landing, the first American aircraft touches down. It's a Marine Corps F-4F Wildcat fighter. The wheels bounce hard. The pilot fights to keep it straight. The runway nearly gives way beneath him. But he makes it. He taxis to a stop. The jungle has been beaten, if only barely. From that moment on, everything changes. Japanese pilots returning from bombing runs stare down in disbelief. The airstrip they were certain they had rendered unusable is alive again. Planes are taking off, landing, refueling, rearming. American aircraft now rise directly from the island they were supposed to deny. Commanders begin sending frantic reports. How is the airfield operational? We shelled it yesterday. It should be destroyed. But it isn't. Because every night after the bombs fall, the Seabees go back out. Under moonlight, under fire, filling craters, dragging steel matting into place, rebuilding what was destroyed hours earlier. The Japanese start calling it the airfield that would not die. And Guadalcanal is only the beginning. What the enemy doesn't yet understand, what they won't fully grasp until it's far too late, is that this speed is not an accident. This doctrine, a new American way of war. Every island the Marines take will be transformed. Every patch of captured ground will become a fortress. And the men with bulldozers will be just as dangerous as the men with guns. Because once the Seabees arrive, the clock starts running against Japan. And the next island will make Guadalcanal look easy. February 19th, 1945. Iwo Jima. Black volcanic sand whips across the landing beaches. Smoke curls from bunkers still smoldering after days of naval bombardment. The air is thick with sulfur and cordite. Marines hit the shore under a sky choked with tracer fire. The island's cliffs seem alive, vomiting bullets and artillery. And somewhere, in the chaos, the Seabees land, not as spectators, but as the unseen engine of victory. Captain William E. Shea surveys the cratered landscape. There's no flat ground, no easy paths, only jagged rocks, smoldering foxholes, and a horizon littered with death. For most soldiers, this is a nightmare. For the Seabees, it's a blueprint. They move in waves. Bulldozers scrape trenches into level surfaces. Trucks haul crushed volcanic rock. Men in helmets and dust-streaked coveralls work shoulder to shoulder with Marines clearing mines and barbed wire. Explosions shake the ground, yet the rhythm continues. Dig, grade, compact, reinforce. Every task is synchronized like a deadly ballet. Japanese snipers and artillery aim to make them fail. Shells burst close, tossing earth and steel into the air. One Seabee is thrown to the ground by a near miss, bleeding but alive, and already his mate is back at the controls. There is no hesitation. Failure is not an option. The airfield must rise from the ashes before nightfall. By the fourth day, a stretch of runway emerges, a narrow ribbon of black volcanic rock that could cradle the wheels of a fighter. The first Corsair lands, wheels bouncing, propellers slicing the smoke-filled sky. Marines cheer, but Shea barely smiles. He already knows the next section must be ready before dawn. Each captured island follows the same terrifying logic. The Japanese assume destruction will slow the Americans. The Seabees prove it won't. On Peleliu, on Saipan, and countless smaller islands, men with picks, shovels, and bulldozers turn hostile jungles into operational airfields in days, sometimes hours. You can almost hear the disbelief from the enemy's command posts. How do they do it so fast? The answer is brutal simplicity, organization, ingenuity, and utter fearlessness. Every Seabee knows the cost of delay. Every crater filled, every root ripped from the soil, every steel mat laid down is a step toward survival. Not just theirs, but the Marines who will fly from this strip to dominate the skies and support the ground troops. By now, the pattern is clear. Japanese commanders fight as if each airfield is just another obstacle. But they don't realize they're building their own defeat. Every time a Seabee crew survives a bombardment to repair a runway, they chip away at Japan's ability to reinforce, retreat, or even breathe. The American presence becomes unstoppable. And yet, there is always the tension, the question hanging in the air. Can they finish before the next wave of shells lands? Can they keep the machines running under fire, the engines roaring, the men moving? At Iwo Jima, as the sun dips behind ash-darkened cliffs, Captain Shea watches a row of Corsairs taxi into position. Each plane represents hours of relentless work, danger, and sweat. The airfield is alive, breathing, and ready to kill. The Japanese can no longer stop the flow of American air power. The islands, once their shield, are now a chain of fortresses, and the men who built them did so under conditions that would have broken most armies. And the next island will be even harder. November 20th, 1943. Tarawa Atoll. The sun barely clears the horizon, and already the sea is streaked with steel. Japanese gunners atop coral ridges aim at landing craft packed with Marines. Explosions hurl water and shrapnel into the air. The waves themselves seem alive, resisting every inch of progress. Yet amid this chaos, something unusual begins to unfold. While the Marines claw their way onto the sand, the Seabees follow, not with rifles, but with bulldozers, graders, and trucks overloaded with steel mats. Japanese officers peer through binoculars, mouths slack. Impossible, one whispers. How can they be here digging, building under fire? How can a runway rise in hours on a shell-pocked atoll? Captain Samuel R. Heinemann directs a team near a cratered strip. The men are caked in salt, blood, and mud. A shell bursts near the bulldozer he's standing on. He feels the heat on his neck, hears the metal groan, but he keeps pushing. Each machine movement, each swing of a pick is choreographed chaos. Within hours, the coral runway begins to take shape. By sunset, a fighter touches down. Its wheels throw up coral dust, and the roar of its engine cuts across the lagoon. Japanese troops, entrenched only yards away, stare in disbelief. Their perfectly calculated defenses, designed to stall any invader, have failed against a new kind of enemy. Men who build as if fire and steel are just background noise. Reports flood Tokyo, airfield operational within 24 hours of landing. Shock spreads. Commanders mutter, revise strategies, double artillery, but it's always too late. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, each island repeats the same story. Americans land, Seabees build, air power rises, Japanese resistance falters. And yet, what terrifies the enemy most isn't just the speed, it's the audacity. The Seabees take what should be a death sentence, bombarded beaches, ash-choked jungles, impossible terrain, and make it work. It's not brute force alone. It's ingenuity, relentless coordination, and an unspoken code. No task is too dangerous, no schedule negotiable. The psychological impact is immediate. Japanese soldiers, who once saw coral reefs and volcanic craters as shields, now see them as traps. Each captured island becomes a prison of their own making. Every airfield that rises under Seabee hands tightens the chokehold on supply lines, reinforcements, and morale. And yet, behind the explosions and roaring engines, a quiet heroism persists. These men are engineers, not fighters, yet their work kills just as efficiently. They labor without glory, without medals in the moment, but their speed and precision decide the fate of thousands. As night falls, the airfields glow under floodlights. Corsairs and Wildcats taxi along newly leveled runways. Marines salute the machines that carried them to victory. Japanese commanders pace in frustration, knowing that the battlefield is no longer just the front lines. It's every inch of earth the Seabees touch. What will happen when the next island is even larger, even more fortified? The enemy doesn't know yet, but the Seabees already have a plan. June 15, 1944. Saipan. The island's interior is a labyrinth of volcanic ridges, jagged cliffs, and dense jungle. Artillery shells shake the ground like small earthquakes. Marines press forward under relentless fire, their boots sinking into mud mixed with ash and blood. Somewhere nearby, a bulldozer revs. There's a sound that seems out of place, too methodical, too calm for a battlefield. That's the Seabees. Lieutenant Commander George B. Morse surveys the chaos. He sees men with rifles ducking behind rocks, trying to survive, and men with tools stepping directly into danger. For most, logic says stop. For Morse and his crews, logic says build. Level this section, he orders. We need a 500-yard runway by nightfall. Around him, crews swing picks, operate graders, and lay steel mats with machine-like precision. The air smells of gunpowder, salt, and burning vegetation. Explosions throw dirt and rock into the air, yet the work continues, relentless, unstoppable. One Seabee wipes blood from his face, climbs back onto the machine, and drives it through craters as if they don't exist. Japanese snipers hide in the ridges, waiting to punish any exposed movement. Artillery tracks every sound, yet the Seabees move like shadows in the chaos, ignoring fear, focusing only on the mission. Within hours, a stretch of coral and steel emerges, sufficient for corsairs to land and take off almost immediately. The effect on the Marines is profound. Supplies arrive faster, close air support dominates enemy positions, and morale surges. Where once the jungle and rocks dictated the pace of the war, the Seabees now do. Each airfield becomes a weapon in itself. Japanese commanders watch in stunned disbelief. They cannot comprehend how an entire island, once defended with careful calculation, can be turned against them in days. Reports reach Tokyo, airstrips operational almost immediately after landing. Resistance is futile. This speed is not luck. It is the essence of American engineering under fire. The Seabees innovate continuously. Temporary steel matting for soft soil, compacting techniques for volcanic ash, rapid drainage to prevent washouts in sudden downpours. They turn obstacles into tools, danger into opportunity. And yet, the human cost is real. Every airfield built under fire exacts a toll. Men are wounded, equipment is destroyed, fatigue sets in. But still, they build. Every plane that lands is proof that the impossible is possible. Every successful takeoff signals dominance in a war where speed and adaptability are as deadly as bullets. By nightfall, Saipan's first operational airstrip glows under searchlights. Corsairs taxi into position, engines screaming, propellers slicing the smoke-filled sky. Marines salute. The Seabees don't. Their work is never done. Because somewhere beyond the horizon, the next island waits. Bigger, harder, more defended, and the Seabees are ready to do it all over again. In Part 2, we'll uncover the island where Japanese commanders believed the Seabees would finally fail, and what happened next changed the course of the Pacific War. Forever. But this story doesn't end here. There was one island where Japanese commanders were certain the Americans would finally break, where every shell erased hours of work and every minute meant survival or collapse. Did the Seabees still win the race against destruction? That is what we'll uncover in Part